pause here. Okay, I'm Sarah Hallberg. I'm interim financial aid officer here at the GSAS Office of Financial Aid. And on behalf of the Office of Financial Aid and the Graduate Student Council, I'd like to welcome you to this tax presentation. This session is specifically for international students. So if you are a US citizen or a permanent resident, we have another session coming up next week on Wednesday, the 29th at 5 p.m. If you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to go ahead and put those in the chat. The chat will be monitored, and there will be time at the end of the presentation to address your questions. We're also joined today by Daryl Ziegler from the Harvard International Office. Thanks for joining us, Daryl. And let's get started. Before we start, I'd just like to review the information that's on the screen right now. The information in this presentation is for general informational purposes only and should not be considered legal advice or personal tax advice. The federal and state income tax rules and requirements are complex and vary based on an individual's personal tax situation. Individuals should refer to the form instructions, tax publications, and information available on the Internal Revenue Service and Massachusetts Department of Revenue Services websites and/or consult with a personal tax advisor. Filing accurate federal and state individual income tax returns is the personal responsibility of each student. And with that out of the way, I'd like to introduce Bob Underwood, CPA, who will be walking us through this presentation today.
Well, thank you, Sarah. I appreciate the opportunity and look forward to getting to the end of this presentation, because the most important component, frankly, is the questions that each of the participants will be submitting. And as we've experienced in the past, I'm sure we'll experience again, there'll be a whole host of questions that hopefully I will be able to answer. And if I need to, I will certainly ask the individual, if I need to defer the answering of that question, I'll ask the individual to send me an email. And as you can see on the initial slide here, you have my email address, and as I have in the past and will continue to do so as long as I am involved in these presentations, is to make myself available because it's possible that, a question may come to mind, not necessarily during this presentation, but maybe in the wee hours of the morning when people are thinking about getting involved in preparing their taxes. So by all means, feel free to send me an email, and I'm very good at responding quickly to these individual questions. I do want to add that with Daryl Ziegler with us today, if there's anything you need to jump in and add during the presentation, feel free to do so, because you're being a member of the university and working specifically with the international student population, I'm sure you can add a whole lot more to this presentation. So with that, let's get things underway. And the first slide, obviously, what we have here is a listing of what we're going to discuss in terms of how you will be filing, defining a non-resident alien taxpayer, tax filing requirements, familiarize you with some of the forms that you may be introduced to for the first time, the income types and taxabilities, a brief discussion about tax treaties, state taxes, useful tips, resources, and then Q&A. So let's move on to the first slide, next slide. And what we're going to talk about here is how you are going to resolve or file your income tax returns with the help of the tax software that is made available to you by way of the university. It is known as Sprint Tax, and the tax software is for the return preparation of tax returns for non-resident students, scholars, trustees, researchers, and other educational immigration statuses to prepare U.S. federal and state income tax returns, specifically Forms 1040-NR and Form 8843. So this tax software is of vital importance. My understanding, it is free of charge for your use by through the university. The international office, as I understand, will be or already has possibly notified students of the fact that the tax software is available for their use. It's an online version that you will enter into, and it's all menu driven. So basically,
Bob, before you go into that,
Go
can I
ahead.
just interject?
Yep.
That we have already communicated fully with our client population. The 1042S forms were issued last week. And in terms of the payments associated with Sprintax, Harvard has a license that will cover your federal returns. That means that it will cover the federal form 1040 and the federal forms 8843. If you need to do add a state to do state taxes, you will have to pay for that on your own, as well as any other optional services that you choose to select from Sprintax. Thanks, Bob.
Wonderful. All right. You answered a few questions that I had with regard to, number one, the availability of the software, which is great. And more importantly, the issuance of those forms 1042S. I know it seems it's late in the tax season, and it truly is. We are now toward the end of March. The filing deadlines for the federal returns are April 18th. Of 2023, which is right around the corner. So I encourage all of you to begin this process, not to be intimidated by it. I mean, we're talking basically a simple process for many of you. There may be some of you individuals that may have a little bit more sophisticated situation and may ultimately find out that the tax software may not serve your needs. But I would venture to say a fairly high percentage of you have very simple U.S. tax filing obligation, and the Sprint tax software will help you tremendously in that regard. So begin the process. Do not wait till the last minute because it's possible you may have some questions along the way. You may confer with sort of your fellow students. You may reach out to me, and I will certainly, if you do reach out to me, help you, point you in the right direction so that you can successfully get through this process. As I said, it's an online service that you'll be using. It's menu driven, and needless to say, and I'm sure I don't need to tell you that it's important that you go through the process thoroughly and respond to the questions being asked of you during the process, because basically by responding correctly, you will obviously, the end result will be exactly what the end result needs to be. If you do not respond correctly, obviously it may result in some misleading information, and the tax software may in fact it provide you with an incorrect result. So just keep that in mind. So as I said, the filing date is April 18th. If for some reason you cannot file the return, the required returns by April 18th, it's possible to get an extension of time to file your returns. That extension of time is a request that you would make of the Internal Revenue Service, and it's automatic. You do not need to, you do need to file a tax form to make that request, but basically it's an automatic process, and the extension of time will bring you up until October 15th of 2023. But I encourage you to address this here and now and get it over and done with. You have certainly other things that you have to consider, and there's no sense in procrastinating and getting it done. Now, in terms of the forms that you need to file, basically there's three possible returns that you may need to file. It will be a federal income tax return, and that would be Form 1040-NR. There is the Form 8843 that Daryl had mentioned. That is not an income tax return. It's just a document just informing the Internal Revenue Service of your status as a student, as I understand it, and we will take a look at it momentarily. And then it's possible that you may have to file a state income tax return or even multiple state returns, depending upon your situation during the course of the year. The tax system runs on a calendar year basis. So all of the income that you earn, that you need to report for US income tax purposes is that income that you've received during the calendar year, obviously starting January 1st of 2022 through December 31st of 2022. So keep that in mind from that standpoint. Now, it's possible if you have no income to report at a minimum, the form that you need to file is Form 8843, and the tax software, the Sprint tax software, will help with the preparation of that particular form and the filing of that form. And as I understand it, in years past, these forms were produced, paper returns were produced and filed, but now the software has the ability to file these forms electronically for you. So that's a great help in terms of expediting the process. So again, don't be intimidated by this process. The software is going to walk you through it, and we'll get you through it successfully. So again, don't wait till the last minute. All right, let's move on to the next slide. Now, let's talk about the definition of a resident versus non-resident. This is basically, for tax purposes, you're either, if you have income, US source income to report, you're either a resident or a non-resident taxpayer. A non-resident for tax purposes is defined as a foreign national that has not obtained the green card or has been in the US more than 183 days during the calendar year, and this is known as the substantial presence test. So it's possible that you may have been in the US for more than 183 days. That does not necessarily mean that you're a resident taxpayer. And that exception applies if you're here under certain visa status. That would be an exception in terms of counting those days. So if you are a scholar on a J or a Q visa, you may remain in the US for 2 years before becoming a resident taxpayer. Go ahead, Daryl. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. And if you're here as a student under an FJ, M, or Q visa, you would remain as a non-resident taxpayer for a 5-year period of time. So once these periods have ended, then the substantial presence test comes into play. The university, as I understand it, has a application or a program that is used known as Glacier. And as I understand it, that is the mechanism that the university determines one's status as being a resident or a non-resident. So that is information that, as I understand, you need to keep up to date with the university so they're treating you correctly as either a resident or non-resident taxpayer. I've seen situations where individuals have not updated their information with the university, and as a result, there's been some misunderstanding as to what your status is for US tax purposes. So you should keep that information up to date with the university during your period of study at the university. So just keep that in mind. Carol?
Bob, just to interject that the Glacier system does do the residency tax determination, but we also use Sprint tax as a backup to that because, of course, it's going to go through the same process. but I also wanted to point out that the 1042S forms are actually populated in the Glacier profile. So if you think that you should have a 1042S, you need to go into your Glacier profile and the document should be there. Thanks,
Okay.
Bob.
Are those forms that individuals need to download, or are they mailed, or how is that process?
No, they have to download them.
I see. Okay. All right. Okay.
Both the 1042S as well as the W-2s generally can be downloaded electronically.
Okay, great. That's certainly good to know from that standpoint. All right. All right. Let's now move on to the next slide. Your tax filing requirements. Non-residents are required to file the following forms. If you're an FJMQ visa holder, at a minimum, you're going to file Form 8843. And if that's the only form you file, and that's the only form that is produced by the Sprint tax software, it's because you may have no U.S. source income to report during the calendar year. So if that's the only form you need to file, and you've properly inputted the necessary information into Sprint tax, that will be the only form that is produced and that you will need to file for U.S. Tax purposes. If you have U.S. source income, then Sprint tax will produce the Form 1040 NR, and that'll be another form. That is the income tax form that is being filed. The Form 8843 is not an income tax form. It doesn't produce a tax liability that one would have to pay. It's just an information form that is required to be filed by non-resident individuals. And then lastly, if necessary, if need be, if there is U.S. source income that needs to be reported on a state income tax return, whether it be Massachusetts or any other state, then that form, the appropriate form, will be produced by the software after you've completed the process. And as far as all other visa holders, basically, they don't necessarily need to file the 8843, but if they have U.S. source income, they will file Form 1040 NR.
I'm sorry, Bob,
Yep.
just for a moment, would you mind if we go back to determining residency just for a second?
Sure.
Because the pandemic has really sort of messed things up. And a number of our people were actually outside of the US for good portions of time.
Yeah.
And so one question with regard to the substantial presence test is, so you're in the first 5 years, but you're not here continuously. I believe that even though you're not here continuously and you might have been gone for 8 or 9 months at a time within that period of time, as long as you get to 5 years and 183 days, you become a tax resident. Is that the wrong way of looking at it?
I honestly don't know. I mean, like you
Yeah.
say, with regard to the COVID issue, in terms of people returning home, the question, I agree from a standpoint of, does that calendar year lapse? Does that now count in the, because it's a calendar year. If, in my understanding, if you're in the US for 1 day within a calendar year, that's counted as 1 calendar year for the 5-year period and for the 2-year period. Now, if you have left the country as a result of the issue with the COVID, I'm not exactly sure, but that's certainly something we can take a closer look at.
I generally tell people, just put the information in the software and trust the software.
I don't disagree with you. I would
All right.
assume that Sprint tax is covering that base, so to speak. And I haven't counted over time where individuals have come and gone, and they don't understand why they would be treated as resident taxpayers. But by entering, and again, to stress that even greater, by making sure that all of this necessary information is inputted into the tax software, the end result will be such that you're either going to be deemed as a resident or a non-resident. And I would think that goes for the Glacier application that is being used. So you would hope that the same result would be, whether it be through Sprint Tax or whether it be through Glacier, that you would end up getting the same result. So I would rely on the software. It's clearly a very, very reputable company that is behind the software, and I'm sure they're on top of this situation adequately to make sure that people are filing the appropriate returns. You will discover that in using the Sprint Tax software, if early in the process, you do have to enter the information pertaining to your presence in the U.S. and what your visa status is, you will find out early on in the process whether the Sprint Tax software you can use or not use. And what Sprint Tax, the response to that would be, is if you have to file as a resident taxpayer, then you would be using a different software and not the Sprint Tax software. And specifically, they would refer you to using the TurboTax software, because it's the same company that produces Sprint Tax, is the TurboTax software, which I'm sure many of you have heard of or may be familiar with regard to possibly considering using it. So that's the alternative if you're deemed to be a resident taxpayer. Okay, all right, let's go to the right there. There we go. All right, just to introduce you to some forms that you may necessarily will be using or producing with regard to the tax software. Here is Form 1040-NR. It's a bit dated, 2020, but for the most part, the format and what's contained on the tax form are pretty much the same from year to year. They may just differ briefly, a little, but basically it's the same information. Obviously, in using the tax software, all of the necessary information will appear on the form and it'll be filed electronically for you. This is a paper version of the 2020 return that would have been prepared, but basically, for the most part, the opening information on the return obviously is name, address, and all of that relevant information, so to speak. And then when we talk about the various lines, we're not going to get into the details of each, but for the most part, the information that will appear on the Form 1040-NR will be contained in the earlier lines of the Form 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 with regard to income that has to be reported, what might be exempt in terms of what needs to be reported and what have you. But again, in entering the appropriate information into the tax software, that information will appear on the appropriate line of Form 1040-NR, whatever that may be. All right, next slide. This is the backside, page 2 of Form 1040-NR. One of the things that I want to bring to your attention is it's quite possible that the income that you may have received would be subject to withholding, and it's possible that the amount of tax withheld may be in excess of what your tax liability ultimately ends up being. And if that's the case, if you paid in more than what you're required to pay in terms of your tax liability, you would be entitled to a refund, which we would all certainly look forward to. I just want to bring to your attention on lines 35 in that section of Form 1040-NR, you have the ability to, if you're entitled to a refund, you have the ability to have that refund deposited directly to a bank account. And by providing the routing number of the bank and the account number, the Internal Revenue Service, as well as the state, because the state of Massachusetts, in virtually every other state in the union, will allow you to have a deposit, your refund deposited directly to an identified bank account. Needless to say, if you're traveling, moving, etc., whatever the case may be, if you can have that money go directly to that bank account as opposed to an address, because if you were to ask for a check to be issued to you and not deposit, your refund not deposited directly to your bank account, it's going to take probably about 6 to 8 to 10 weeks possibly for that check to be issued. Whereas with regard to having it deposited directly to your account, once the return is processed, the turnaround with regard to issuing refunds is a fairly short period of time. So obviously you're going to expedite that process, number one. And again, if for some reason you're not at the address that that check would be issued to, it might get lost, misplaced, and what have you. So I certainly encourage you to utilize that particular option. So keep that in mind. All right, next slide. The next slide is a very abbreviated form 8843, but basically this is again that statement that if at a minimum, if you're an F or a J visa holder, would be produced by the Sprint tax software and filed with the Internal Revenue Service. It just identifies who you are and that you're a student, and that's all the information they need to know. So it's just simply an information document that would go to the Internal Revenue Service and the Internal Revenue Service alone. All right, the next document is a facsimile of a W-2 form, and a W-2 form is a form that it's an information form that is issued if you are an employee of an employer and have received wages. You would receive a W-2 form possibly. They come in different sizes and shapes and colors, but basically they have all the basic information in terms of your earnings and whatever taxes have been withheld from those earnings. And basically, this form is not only issued to you, but it's also issued to the Internal Revenue Service. So basically, although this is a voluntary tax system, there are some checks and balances in place whereby the government knows that you have income, and they do match up the W-2 form that they may have received from your employer with the actual return that you ultimately file. So it sort of keeps everybody honest in that respect. So if you have worked for an employer and should have received or believe you should have received the W-2 form and haven't, I would certainly suggest that you reach out and inquire as to why you may not have received it. Because if you file an income tax return and not report this income, at some point down the road, you will be notified by the IRS that, oh, by the way, we have this W-2 form, but you didn't reflect it on your income tax return. We're going to make a change to your income tax and so forth. So it's no big deal. I mean, people innocently omit income, and at some point down the road, the IRS would reach out and let you know that, oh, you did certainly overlook this. Here is the additional tax that you owe. Do you agree? If so, please pay this additional amount. But also what they will do is add interest and penalties to it, which you would certainly want to avoid. So just keep that in mind. Next document is the Form 1042S that, as Darrell indicated, are available. And for many of you, you may be getting this form. And if you haven't already downloaded it, be sure that you do download it so that when you go through the process of inputting the information into SprintTax, this will be part of the process. So this is the format. It's pretty much the same. This, again, it's a dated form 2016, but the appearance of the 1042S is pretty much the same today as it was back in 2016. So make sure you reach out and download that particular document. All right, the next form is a form 1099 dividend, DIV, 1099 DIV. And this would be issued by a brokerage firm or investment firm where you may have stocks and securities and so forth, informing you of the dividends that you may have received on a particular stock or through some type of brokerage account. So this, again, like the W-2 form, is an information document that, again, if you've received dividends during the course of the calendar year, you should be receiving and should be reported as part of your income on your U.S. return. So again, if you have securities and investments and so forth that are paying dividends, you should have by now. These should have been issued to you back in January. A lot of these financial institutions nowadays, it's getting later and later in terms of them issuing these documents, but a lot of the institutions these days allow you to download these forms from your website, your account, and then obviously make them available to you in that manner as opposed to mailing them out to you. So if, again, you have dividends you've received, make sure you have this form 1099 DIV when you begin the process of preparing your return. The next document is an interest income document identified as Form 1099 INT. If you have interest income that you might be receiving on in bank accounts, savings accounts, what have you, that institution should be issuing a 1099 INT to you. Like the W-2 and like the 1099 DIV, a copy of this goes to the Internal Revenue Service so that, again, make sure you report this income on the return when preparing your SprintTax input. All right, next slide is a U.S. source income, basically types of U.S. source income that you may be familiar with or may have received during the course of the year. Common types are wages, salaries, and compensation. And we'll to the next slide, we'll talk about, how that information is reported to you. Another item of income would be scholarships and fellowships, covering the cost of your tuition and other required fees. Any self-employment income, if you happen to be self-employed, have an activity where you're self-employed, that would be reportable U.S. source income. Investment income that you might be receiving from investments that you may have here in the U.S. Dividend and interest, as we talked about with regard to those 1099s. And if you have any real estate that you're receiving any rental income from, that is reportable as well. So all of this income needs to be reported on your return if you've received it during the calendar year. All right, next slide. Well, this is basically a summary of the types of income and its taxability. If you have qualified scholarships or fellowships. If you've received qualified fellowships or scholarships, these amounts are not taxable. There's no withholding, and you will frankly not be informed of that income in any way. So what you want to do, one thing you want to keep in mind is the Internal Revenue Service has a publication, it's publication 970, which talks about taxable scholarships and fellowships. Basically, the financial aid that you may be receiving from the university may come in two forms. It may come in a non-taxable form, and that's for those qualified expenses that you are receiving from the university, and they're not subject to tax. And we'll talk about that momentarily. It's possible a portion of your financial support may be in the form of non-qualified scholarships or fellowships, where those amounts are taxable. And if that's the case, you would be receiving, they would be subject to tax. There may be some treaty provisions that apply where they may not be taxable in full or partially, and you will be receiving that Form 1042-S identifying this income. Other sources of income, prizes and awards, those are taxable. Compensation that you might be receiving, whether it be from the university or an outside employer, would be taxable. And any compensation, as a non-employee that you're receiving would be subject to tax as well. So there are the various types of income that may be subject to tax or not subject to tax. As you can see, there's more that are subject as opposed to not. And let's move on to the next slide so that we can talk about qualified scholarships and fellowships and non-qualified. Basically, there's a distinction with regard to what is taxable and what's non-taxable. And basically, if you've received a qualified scholarship or fellowship that is non-taxable, if you're enrolled as a candidate for a degree, which you are at the university, and the scholarship or fellowship that you're receiving is used to pay fees for enrollment, books, supplies, equipment required for the course. So basically, if that fellowship or scholarship is for that particular purpose, then it would not be taxable. Whereas,
I'm sorry, Bob, can I interrupt you for just a second?
Yeah.
What about reimbursements?
In terms of reimbursements, if you're being reimbursed for something, I would say it's not taxable.
Okay.
You shouldn't be receiving a 1099 if the university has some type of procedure that one goes through in terms of being reimbursed, then no 1099 would be issued because they wouldn't necessarily be responsible to issue a 1099. Now, basically, the next sort of non-qualified scholarship and fellowships are considered taxable if they include the primary one is stipends for living expenses. Most graduate students are receiving some type of scholarship or fellowship, which is often referred to as a stipend, and that stipend is to help them with their living expenses such as room and board. And that's a primary amount of income, a significant amount, because as I understand it, those stipend amounts are upwards in the neighborhood of $2,000 to $3,000 a month. So that can add up, and that's a taxable amount of money. Now, if you're being paid for travel, research, in other optional equipment, those are taxable amounts, although you may deem those to be for reimbursement of travel or research. But the fact is, those amounts are taxable and have to be reported on your U.S. income tax return. So just keep that in mind. And again, I refer you to the IRS publication, the publication 970, which goes into great detail with regard to distinguishing qualified versus non-qualified scholarships and fellowships. And there's in fact a worksheet within that publication that helps you arrive at what would be your non-qualified scholarship or fellowship amount, which would be taxable and reportable by you. So that's a very, very important and helpful publication in making that determination. All right, next slide is a brief, very brief discussion about tax treaties, but basically in the tax software will help you. There are a number of different tax treaties with a number of different countries, I believe upwards of about 60 countries as I understand. And they cover a whole range of types of income that may be exempt for tax purposes. So fortunately, the tax software will help you through this process and identify whether some or all of a source of income that you're receiving is taxable or not taxable or partially taxable. So you should be able to rely thoroughly on the tax software to providing the appropriate result necessary in terms of excluding that income that may be exempt under an existing treaty between your country and the U.S. So keep that in mind, and that will hopefully give you the correct result. All right, next slide. Social Security numbers, SSN, a Social Security number, or an ITIN, or an individual taxpayer identification number. As I understand it, if basically the only form you need to file with the Internal Revenue Service is the 8843, you neither need a Social Security number or an individual taxpayer identification number. Now, beyond that, if you have U.S. source income, you may need to have a Social Security number or an ITIN number. And as I understand it, Daryl, help me out, I believe your office prefers to help individuals seek an ITIN. Is that
yes? We provide the resources for them. And I know that there are a number of people on the webinar today who have applied for ITINs and had their ITIN applications either rejected or they just haven't heard back after several months of waiting. And so for those of you folks who are wondering what should you do with your tax return since you don't have a response from your ITIN application, what the HIO is telling you to do is to follow our ITIN application instructions as listed on our website, but do not use the mailing instructions. We want you to bundle your ITIN application together with your completed federal return, and you will send both things to the federal return address. I think, go ahead, Bob.
Okay, no, so what you're saying is you're suggesting that, and I assume the Sprint tax will allow a paper return filed?
Right, and still, even though e-filing is available, my sense is that most of the students are still needing to send paper returns.
As a result of needing to get their ITIN number?
No, just because they don't meet whatever the requirements are. But if someone is going to e-file, and they is able to e-file, but they still haven't, and they have prepared the ITIN application following our instructions.
Yeah.
If you're going to e-file, then in that case, you cannot send the ITIN application with the tax return. In that case, you must use the standard mailing instructions on our website.
Okay, all right, and that certainly makes sense in that respect. So unfortunately, I'm not sure what is going on. I wished I had an answer with regard to And I think it all really relates back to the pandemic and the lack of staff, I believe, at the Internal Revenue Service to stay on top of this. So it's unfortunate. It slows the process down. So as Daryl just indicated, follow that process. I had a situation with regard to trying to obtain ITIN numbers. It was a complete nightmare, and it was a long, drawn out process. So I would follow what the university is suggesting to hopefully expedite it as quickly as you possibly can. All right. Thank you, Daryl. All right. Next slide. With regard to state taxes, again, what you need to do is rely on the Sprint tax software to give you direction with regard to whether you need to file a state return or not. The appropriate information that you need to input into the system will result in whether you need to file a state return, specifically a Massachusetts return, or any other state for that matter. So rely on the software to give you the end result that you need in terms of filing any appropriate or necessary state income tax returns. All right, next slide. Just basically sort of a handful of little tips and items to keep in mind with regard to this process. Again, we're going to be filing, hopefully most of you will be filing electronically, which will certainly expedite the process. With regard to receiving any type of confirmation from the Internal Revenue Service, that is not the case and is not available to you. I suspect if, for example, you file a return and you're entitled to a refund and you get that refund, that's pretty much a pretty good confirmation that the return's been processed, it's accurately prepared, and that an refund has been issued. So that's as good a confirmation as I think any of you would like to get. As far as your responsibility in terms of keeping records, for the most part, there's a 3-year statute of limitations with regard to you requesting a refund from the IRS or the IRS requesting more money from you. And what I mean is a 3-year statute from the due date of the return. So April 15th of 2023 is your filing date for your 2022 return. If 3 years later passes, then that tax year is closed and the IRS cannot come after you, or nor can you go back to ask for a refund. So that's the general statute of limitations. There are other statutes, but we're not going to get into a discussion about those. So it's the 3-year window. So typically you should keep your tax records available for that period of time in the event the IRS comes back to you questioning something in that regard. So 3 years, keep those files open. If you've missed or incorrectly filed a return, you should take care of that as soon as possible. And the reason for that is if you didn't file a return, it's possible that if you do owe taxes, it's possible that if the IRS were to come and inquire about the filing of that return, the tax assessment would be made. And unfortunately, there would be interest and penalties that would be added to that amount. So you would want to avoid that at all costs. The penalties and interest can certainly add up over a period of time. Needless to say, at this point in time, with interest rates increasing, the penalty in interest rates are increasing as well. Prior to these recent times with recent increases in interest rates, the penalty in interest rates were fairly low, but the fact of the matter is you would want to avoid any assessment of penalties at all costs anyway. So, if you need to file a return or file a incorrect return, that would be the case where you would have to amend that incorrectly filed return to properly reflect the income on that particular return. All right, next slide. In dealing with the IRS, basically, if you get a phone call from someone saying they're from the IRS, do one of two things. Sort of go along with the phone call and get some enjoyment out of it, or just hang up. Basically, the IRS does not call taxpayers. If you do get a call, someone indicating that they're with the Internal Revenue Service, it's a scam. It's just basically a scam, and obviously hang up. I've been known to have received calls in the past, and I've sort of gone along with them only to, at some point during the conversation, they ultimately find out that I'm having some fun with them, and they ultimately hang up. So they'll never reach out to you by way of phone. The initial contact that you would have with the Internal Revenue Service would be some sort of notification by mail.
Excuse me.
And, then that would, continue from there. Typically, if you get some type of correspondence from the IRS, maybe it's as a result of, again, as I said earlier, failing to report income that they've picked up that should have been reflected on your return. They will go through a complete explanation as to why they're corresponding with you. They will also identify how much additional tax that you may owe as a result of inadvertently overlooking reporting that income. And if you agree with the findings that they indicate in their notice, the thing to do is to respond quickly, and if there's additional taxes that have to be paid, you should pay them as soon as you possibly can. So,
Hey, Bob.
Yep, go ahead.
This is the time of year where, of course, that people are getting scammed left and right.
Yep.
I just want to make sure that everyone on the webinar understands, as Bob says, the IRS, they are not going to call you. They're not going to call you and demand that you do anything for them right there at that minute over the phone.
Yeah.
Don't ever give your personal information to someone who's doing that to you. If you want to try to verify whether it's a scam or not, you can always say something like, give me your number, maybe, and I'll call you back.
Yep.
And then you can do some other research, but just be very careful.
Yeah, no, I mean, clearly, again, in the few calls that I've received over the years, as soon as they get an inkling that you know what they're up to, they basically hang up. As you say, if you ask for a name or a return phone call number, they'll typically hang up. So do not ever, as Daryl indicated, do not ever provide any personal information to anyone over the phone. Again, if at any point you need to have contact with the Internal Revenue Service over the phone, they will provide you, again, that initial correspondence will typically include a phone number if one needs to call them. And as soon as you reach someone, that individual will identify themselves by name, and they will also identify themselves by their number, their ID number. And obviously I would jot that information down so that you can have it. But typically, the system is set up such that you would typically work with the Internal Revenue Service by way of communication, written communication in correspondence, as opposed to dealing directly with someone, in all honesty. So that's how you would communicate. All right, next slide. If you do get a notice from the IRS, and I'm just sort of reiterating this, if you do get a notice from the IRS because maybe you failed to report some income, read the notice thoroughly, understand what they're asking of you. And again, if you agree with the findings, then obviously respond quickly. And if there's any additional balance due, pay that as quickly as possible to avoid any further penalties and interest. That's the best approach to take, and it's the most expeditious way of dealing with this, with the Internal Revenue Service. And then the last slide So, okay, the last side, if for some reason you get a notification from the IRS that you're being audited, there's two reasons taxpayers get audited. It's either a random audit or there is some concern with regard to maybe a position you've taken on your tax return. If it's a random audit, and that happens from time to time, it's basically the IRS is taking a sampling of taxpayers to see how a particular tax situation is being handled on a tax return. I wouldn't be concerned about that type of audit. Obviously, if you're being audited because they're somewhat suspicious of what you're reporting on your return, then that's a different story. But basically, as far as I can understand, in terms of your situations, you're not filing a return that anyone's going to be suspicious of, in all honesty. So audits these days are very, very limited. But basically, if you do get audited, just go through the process. And if you feel sort of intimidated by the process, you can certainly hire somebody to represent you in that regard. But basically, you know, if you have nothing to hide, just basically go through the process, respond accordingly, and you know, will end, I'm sure, very quickly in that respect. So having said that, I think we're done, and I suspect we have a whole bunch of questions I hope we can answer. Thank you.
Well, actually, Bob, I'm sorry, I've lost myself here. We have gone through the chat and all of the questions that were pending there.
Okay.
There was nothing that I couldn't, there was nothing that I couldn't respond to.
Okay. All right. Great. Excellent. All right. Perfect. All right. If that's the case.
All right. Here's another question just came in. What should we do if we qualify as a tax resident and neither TurboTax nor H&R Block support the Form 1040? All right, if you are determined, I'm sorry, Bob, let me let you answer that.
Yeah.
Someone wants to know what they should do if TurboTax or H&R Block won't take in a 1040 NR or won't support the 1040 NR.
Well, I mean, if when you're talking about Sprint tax versus TurboTax, we're talking about Sprint tax dealing with the need to file a Form 1040 NR as a non-resident taxpayer, whereas TurboTax supports those taxpayers who have to file resident returns. So you're either going to fall in one or the other. The only possibility that one might have is if they have dual status, so to speak, as a resident versus a non-resident. In that instance, you would be, if you have dual status during a particular tax year, you would need to use TurboTax for the preparation of your income tax return. If you're strictly a non-resident, you'll use the Sprint tax. If you're strictly a resident, you would use TurboTax, or you know, you could use the H&R Block online services. So that's how that would typically play out.
And so the next question essentially has to do with 1042Ss. And generally at Harvard, they're not withholding any state taxes for 1042Ss.
Yeah.
And so they want to know, does that mean, do they file or do they not file?
Well, again, it's because no taxes were withheld for state purposes, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're not required to file a state return. Again, I would use as a reliance in terms of your need to file a state return, the Sprint tax software. If the software concludes that you need to file a state return, then you need to file a state return, and whatever state taxes are owed would be your responsibility.
Okay, let's just go through, make sure we don't double anything. So this other question sort of relates to what you just said about people who are in a dual status year.
Yep.
And you essentially address that if you're in the first half of the year and you have not yet met the substantial presence test, any software will still show you as being a non-resident, and you'll be able to use that software. But once you go beyond that 183 days past the 5th year, then you are a U.S. tax resident, and you'll have to choose whatever domestic software that you want to file your taxes if you don't want to do it by hand. And we're not going to make any referrals for that necessarily, because you need to have choice. SprintTax will send you to TurboTax, but there are many other companies out there. I use TaxAct. There's TaxSlayer and all sorts of other tax programs out there. You have to determine what will work best for you based on your budget and what you need to accomplish.
Absolutely. Yes, I agree.
Divya, your question, I think, is a bit too much for this. Why don't you contact me specifically, and if we need to bring in Bob, we'll do that. Will SprintTax ask and consider my marital status? Yes, they will. But just know that most non-residents outside of 4 nationalities, you will not be able to claim any federal benefits or credits for your dependent. Is that correct, Bob?
That's correct. Exactly. Yep.
Okay. And this relates to Harvard funding. If I'm a TF, that means teaching fellow at Harvard, will I receive a W-2 or a 1042-S? TF work is basic wage work, and that would have been reflected on the W-2. The Comptroller's Office issued the W-2s at the end of January. SprintTax asks for a foreign tax ID. I don't have an ITIN yet. I have several foreign tax IDs. How do I decide which to fill in? Bob, do they actually need to do that? Put in anything?
In terms, I mean, the ITIN is what you need to include. So, I mean, as you alluded to earlier, in terms of what one needs to do, is to file for the ITIN together with their tax return. I don't think the use of any other identification number is going to be of any help. I mean,
right.
you either have a social security number or an ITIN. And if you don't have an ITIN, then what the university is suggesting to do is I agree with, in terms of filing a paper return.
Okay. There's still some confusion about the state tax return, but I don't think we can address that. Question about residency status. SprintTax is asking me to list all the previous times I've been in the US. Sometimes I visited without a visa for vacation, and there's no option on SprintTax to list visits without a visa. Should I still? All right, so the only person who would enter the US without a visa itself. No, that's not true. Let me put it to you this way. If you entered under ESTA, then that does have a visa classification as a tourist. All right. The actual classification is WB for if you enter for business, or WT if you enter for tourism. The only other category of people that might be in that would be Canadians who just crossed the border, but you would still be crossing the border as a tourist. So I would list a B1, B2 status for that. All right, this is again, first year PhD student. The document I received for Blue Cross is not the 1095. How do I include this in SprintTax? Correct me if I'm wrong, Bob. My folks, my students and scholars generally don't need to pay attention to the 1095. What you should be paying attention to is the 1099 HC, and that is what you would have, or most likely would have received from Blue Cross Blue Shield. The 1099 HC reflects your Massachusetts health insurance status through Blue Cross Blue Shield. The 1095 would have reflected your health insurance status for the Internal Revenue Service. But because of certain laws or regulations being repealed, the function of the 1095 is not what it was intended to be. And I don't think you need to do anything.
That's
Is that correct, Bob?
Yeah, that is correct. Yeah, the 1095 is a function that these employers or insurance companies are going through, but the form is of no value.
Right, okay. If you've not been in the US during the tax year, do we have to file taxes? I'm a non-resident. Again, I would say, and Bob will chime in, the basic answer is no. But if you are outside of the US and you were still receiving Harvard funding, I really don't know what to tell you. Because some of the funding was paid as domestic money, some of it was paid as foreign money. I don't know what to do with that. Any ideas, Bob?
Offhand, no. I mean, we can take a closer look at it. If that individual wants to send me an email, I'd be more than happy to research it.
Okay. If you have several jobs at Harvard, will you receive one W-2? The answer is yes, you should. No. I wish Natasha was here. I believe you're going to get a W-2 for each job that you had. And that's not a problem. You can input several W-2s in either Sprintax or any other software that's out there.
Yeah, that's possible. I mean, the mechanics of what the university does with regard to W-2s, whether it's, one or many, they just all would be inputted into the software and you go from there.
So again, people are confused about what a stipend means. And what the way that I try to explain this, Bob, is if you get any money that goes beyond the payment of your tuition and required fees, that money is taxable. I don't care what it's called. If it's above the cost of tuition and fees, it's taxable.
And I agree. I mean, I've often referred to it as it's sort of a discretionary funds, so to speak, in terms of your use of those funds. I mean, those qualified educational expenses, you don't physically receive that money. It ends up being reflected on your account statement as a payment against what is owed to the university. But the stipend, for the most part, is it's discretionary. You can do with it as you please. The intent, obviously, is to cover your living expenses. So that's how I've often referred to it as. But again, I would refer you to that Internal Revenue Service publication 970, where it in fact has a worksheet that you can go through to determine exactly what would be considered a non-qualified financial resource.
And I think that was more or less it.
Okay.
Yeah, that was the end of the questions.
Okay.
So this is actually good timing because I'm gonna have to go soon. But Lisa and Judy, did you guys want to take over?
Yeah, are there any other questions? It looks like
No, we cleared
we've
it out.
covered everything in the chat here. I've been monitoring. Thanks, Daryl, for handling these during the presentation and after. I think that we've covered everything. And if there aren't any more questions, we will stop recording and post this to the GSAS website as soon as we can.
I thought there was one last question, but it was a thank you. So thank you to everybody.
And thank you very much, Bob and Daryl, for joining us today.
One question, who is the person who could help us if anything goes wrong? I don't know what you mean by goes wrong, but generally that's going to be me to help you work through what the issue is, and I'll make the appropriate referrals. Okay?
Thank you, Daryl.
All right, thanks, Bob.
All right, appreciate it.
All right.
And Judy and Lisa, thank you very much.
Thank you, Bob. And thank you again,
just
Daryl.
to reinforce, if anyone wakes up in a cold sweat in the middle of the night with a tax question, feel free to send me an email. I won't answer it immediately, that's for sure, but I will get back in touch. So thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Bye.
Yeah, bye now.